Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Emma. My pronouns are she, her, and I am one of the community outreach liaisons here at Eating Recovery Center and Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Center. We have a lot planned for this next hour, so I'll be quickly going into the guidelines, and also I will be pasting them in the chat, and then also I will be pasting them in the chat throughout the next hour that we have with each other. I'm just going to quickly go through them. So this workshop is not therapy, nor is it a replacement for therapy. Be open and respectful. Remember that we all come from different backgrounds and life experiences. Honor confidentiality. We encourage you to share in the chat as you feel comfortable. And when responding to the prompts, our facilitators will be asking your questions to our facilitator, Joni. Grief can be a heavy topic. We encourage you to take care of yourselves as needed. Stretch, snack, water, leave, etc. during group, and please make plans for self-care after group or when doing the assigned activities that Joni will be talking about later. I am so excited to get this series started and have all of you be introduced to our incredible facilitator, Joni. And with that, welcome to week 1 of our Grief Release series with Joni Dwyer, and I will pass it over to you, Joni.
Hi, everybody. Well, this is really interesting for me to do. I love talking about grief and loss, which makes me really fun at parties. Often what happens is people say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I say, "I'm a grief and loss counselor." And they say, "Oh, so nice to see you." And they walk away. And then they ask my son-in-law, "What do you do?" And he says, "Oh, I am a chemical dependency counselor." And they say, "I only had 2." And then they walk away from him. And he and I have all kinds of discussions with each other. So we spend a lot of time with one another when we go to dinner parties. I'm so honored to be here today. I really mean that. I have walked through a lot of significant losses in my life. And as a human being, of course, we always walk through all kinds of losses, gains and losses throughout our life. And someone helped me along the way. And I found information that helped me process what was going on in me so my heart could heal. So I love being able to share this with you. It takes a lot of courage to show up to talk about grief and loss. And so I just want to say, way to go. I usually do this class in person, and I usually do it over a 5-week period. And I usually spend 2 hours a class. And this is going to be a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose, I think. This is a curriculum-based workshop. And I think that's really important. It's not set up as a support group, but we're going to be very supportive of one another in it, if that makes sense. And I think it probably does to all of you because you know how to support one another. That's the key to working through grief and loss, is to have support and be supportive, right? So I'll be sharing part of my story as we go, because we all have story, right? And it's how I got here. So let's get started on this information, okay? I like that title, Moving Toward Hope and Healing. That's our goal, right? So here are the goals for this workshop: to gain an understanding of the nature of grief and its effect on us, right? We're going to explore, acknowledge, and honor our unmourned losses. We're going to learn to use some tools for processing pain and move toward healing. And we're going to see if we can find some healthy ways to release the pain while we're honoring our feelings. Now, along the way, if you have any questions or you need some clarity, just put that in the chat and Emma's going to take care of that for us, okay? All right. And we can do it along the way if that's okay with you, Emma. Or we can do it at the end, whatever you think is best. So each week, what we'll do is we'll study a subject that's related to grief, loss, and mourning. And actually, the order that comes in is loss, grief, and mourning, and some of the tools that might help you process your own personal loss. There's going to be homework. Homework. This kind of homework is just so you can practice whatever that week's tool is, so you can see if it works for you. Now, sometimes those tools you've tried in the past and you didn't like it at all, right? One of them is journaling. Some of us are journalers and some aren't. And these tools don't work for everybody. Grief is a little bit like walking through a wilderness and you're trying to find a path. And these tools are the things that we're going to put in this. Each of you have a backpack, and you're going to put these tools in your backpack. And so they're going to be different for everybody. Just like when you go on a hike, you probably have something different in your backpack than the guy next to you. So that's why I'm going to ask you, if you will, if you can, right? Try these tools, even if you're trying them again, so you may come back and go, no, I was right the first time, I'll never use that again. But do what you can to use that tool that week, okay? All right. So here's an interesting statement. Grief is what's right with us, not what's wrong with us. You know, in our Western culture, we have really lost the art of grieving. And honestly, instinctively, we know how to do this. But we've gotten blocked in our culture from following through on some of these things that are instinctive to us. Grief is common, but it's not a universal experience. Isn't that an interesting statement? Someone was talking about this the other day. Only those who have the ability to love will feel grief at the loss of a person or thing that we care about, because it's predicated on our ability to attach. So grief is a sign of love. That's why it's what's right with us, not what's wrong with us. It gives us the ability to feel and to embrace our life in that way. It doesn't need to be treated. Oftentimes, grief is talked about almost as a disease, but it does not need to be treated. It needs to be understood and processed. And the other thing I wanted to say to you is I'm going to be sharing part of my story with you. I'm going to be sharing these things. Please take what you like and leave the rest, okay? Because I can only share my journey and the information that I have gleaned over the last 20 years of studying and working as a grief counselor, and apply whatever you can get from this study, okay? All right. So let's get some definitions, so we're all on the same page here. Loss is when someone or something we care about is threatened, harmed, or taken away, right? That's why grief comes in a lot of variety. We always think of death as the first thing we think of with loss a lot of the time, or with grief, is death. But the truth is there are lots of different things that cause grief in our lives. So when someone, something we care about is threatened, harmed, or taken away, it creates grief. And grief is the way we feel and think when we're faced with loss. Mourning is the outward expression of those feelings and thoughts, right? So unacknowledged or unmourned losses most often cause prolonged pain. If you're struggling with ongoing pain, mourning is how you're going to integrate your losses and move toward healing. And we'll talk more about that later. Shadow grief. Have you guys ever felt this? When you think about the loss that really brought you to this workshop, think about that loss. For me, that loss that started me on this journey with grief release in particular was the death of my husband. He had lung cancer and he died after 6 months from diagnosis. We were married for 33 years. I had never lived alone in my life. I'm a twin. I mean, I had never been alone in my life. And, but but I was very independent, had my own business, all kinds of things. But it didn't matter when you share a life with someone and they pass away, it's like one of your mirrors is gone, a big one. And that's what it was for me. And I was shocked at the level of impact that left on me. And one of the things that happened, and as we go, I'll tell you more about that as we get to it. But one of the things that happened is I would have this shadow grief the weeks prior to a birthday, an anniversary. It didn't matter what it was. I would have this grief would happen, and I would oftentimes wonder, what is going on with me? And it usually would come up about a month before a birthday or an anniversary, or something. If there was something going on in my life that was special, then I would have this shadow grief. And when I recognized it, it was like, oh, that's what that is. That's what's going on. Anticipatory grief. These are the feelings, emotions, and reactions that occur prior to the loss. For me, of course, this happened while I was taking care of my husband as he was walking through treatment for lung cancer. When there is a big lifestyle change, that alone creates grief, right? When we get unplugged from normal, that creates grief. And so we were certainly unplugged from normal when he got a diagnosis. And I could see not only that he was going downhill, but our life changed so much and I had to let go of so many things that there was a lot of anticipatory grief. Now, I watch people do it better than we did in a lot of ways with grieving, where they actually talk to one another and work through this together. And my favorite anticipatory grief story is about a couple that I knew. She told me this story and said I could share it. And she is a friend of mine, and she is larger than life. She has this personality that fills a room. And you'll see what I mean when I explain it to you, tell you the story. So she and her husband had been married forever. He had lived with cancer for 5 years and was in his last week of living. And the hospice nurse said, you need to tell him he can go. And so she said, they had worked through so many things, what she was going to do, where she was going to live. They had it all figured out, had worked through so much. And she's, in her way, she said, okay, honey, you can go. Okay, you can go. And he hadn't said a word for a week and was just lying in bed with his eyes closed. And he said, I'll go when I'm damn well ready. And the reason they could do that was because they had worked through so much anticipatory grief, right? Then they both cracked up. I mean, I love that story. And she laughed when she told me, right? But a lot of the time, this anticipatory grief, this is not fun. None of this is fun, right? Sometimes we have a living loss. Now, this is an interesting grief. This one results from significant loss that isn't physical death. Yeah, this can be caused by estrangements, health issues, diagnoses, all kinds of things that keep going on. A lot of times this is included in divorce because you still have to work with that person that you've gone through so much with. So grief is that experience when we lose something or someone that's important to us. Usually that first loss we think of course, is the death of a loved one, but shattered dreams, unmet expectations, right? Divorce, loss of relationship, loss of community, loss of our identity. That shocked me. I had no idea that I had to find out who I was without Chad on this earth. How did I walk around like this? And once I learned that, it was so helpful. You know, sometimes we move, so we lose the home that we left. Even when we choose some of these things, loss of financial security, that one we don't choose. But even when I moved where I am now, we really wanted to be here and love this place. But we left a place that we'd been for 17 years with all of those roots and all of those friends. And so that caused a lot of grief in my life, that I needed to work through it. We're affected at every level when we're experiencing loss and grief: physical, cognitive, emotional, social, behavioral, spiritual, every level. Processing grief is unique to each person, right? We're as unique as our stories. So every person will process grief or not process grief uniquely. Many factors determine our experience: training, culture, health, just to name a few. And who taught us how to process grief, right? That's a good question to ask yourself. What did I learn about processing grief? And who taught me that? Most of the time when I ask that in class, what I get is, suck it up, buttercup. We just learn to go on and stuff all of that grief. And so that's why I love this information, because there is a way to unstuff that grief a little at a time at your own speed. And that's what we refer to when we talk about you convert your grief into mourning. You take the feelings and the thoughts when you have loss, and you find a way to express them in a healthy way. And that's grief work. That's what helps you move through grief. You won't get over grief. You'll get through grief, right? But grief, when we have big things that happen in our lives, grief doesn't go away. That is not the goal. Grief doesn't go away, but the pain softens. And it no longer dominates our lives, right? The loss of my husband is not the most dominating force in my life. It was at first. It certainly was for a period of time. I thought about it all the time. I woke up in the morning, everything was okay for the first couple of seconds, and then I would remember, right? And that's the way it was until I could work through it enough that the pain could soften. And what's happened over time is the love now outweighs the pain. And so when I think of it, it doesn't create pain for me. It's like this sort of bittersweet love, if that makes sense. It's hard to explain that, but it gets better. It doesn't. This is not about getting rid of grief or shoving it someplace so it'll go away. And we'll talk more about that as we go. Everyone affected by grief is fragile and sensitive and needs compassion, patience, and kindness. If you've noticed in yourself that when you're in grief, man, it is easy to get your feelings hurt. And I don't think that's just me. It's easy to misunderstand something. And it's really important to realize that we feel fragile and sensitive when we're in grief, and we need to have some compassion and patience and kindness for ourselves, right? You'll hear me say over and over, please treat yourself as a treasured friend. If your friend felt the way you do, what would you do for her? What would you do for him, right? So here's some information about grief. It's messy. This is very messy business. You cannot create order out of grief, which is difficult because we spend most of our lives trying to create order out of chaos, right? It's contradictory. It doesn't make sense. A lot of the things, for instance, I loved all of the memories that I got to keep, right? Your memories stay with you. They don't go away. I love the memories and I love thinking about them. And they were the very thing that would also make me cry. They were the thing that would just break my heart again, right? Just touch that wounded heart. And so it's very confusing. It's aggravating. Oh my gosh, when is this going to get over? When am I going to get through this? It's overwhelming, right? There's this thing called grief bursts. It usually happens when you don't want it to, and it's embarrassing. So I would be in the grocery store and I would see something that my husband's favorite food, and I would remember, no, I don't buy that now. And I would be in tears. And so here's what you do with that. I learned to do this. I learned to do this by taking this grief class, actually, was to leave the basket, park it, go outside to the car, have a good cry, and just think about Chad and let it happen. And then when I got through, I would ask myself gently and kindly, do you want to go back in and finish, or do you need to go home? And then I would do that, right? Treat yourself like a treasured friend. So that's what my overwhelm looked like. And it's called grief bursts. Now, when that happened, because somebody I knew walked up to me and said, how are you? That's all they had to do. How are you? How are you doing? It's like, no, don't ask me that. And then there I am again in tears. And I would say, and of course, then they were like, oh no. So I would just say, oh, it's a grief burst. This just happens. And then I was more comfortable with it, and so were they. So that's I love that too. That's really good. And grief is brutal. It just is. Here are some of the responses to grief. Aren't these dandies? See if you can pick out one or all of them that you have experienced or are experiencing. Any of those stand out for you? You can put that in the chat. Right? I mean, this disbelief piece, I'm going through a sadness right now of somebody near and dear to me, I mean, precious to me, has been diagnosed with cancer. And I keep going to this. I can't believe this is happening, right? This is just part of it. That anxiety, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? Because grief just kind of kicks the structure out from under us and creates a lot of anxiety. C.S. Lewis said, I had no idea that grief felt so much like fear. Isn't that true? Sick a lot. Sometimes we catch everything that's out there to catch when we're sick because our immune system is down. So it's important to take care of yourself. Do what you can to take care of yourself, right? Sleep, eat some good food, be with friends, do those things that you know are healthy for you, even though you don't feel like it, okay? Isolation is truly our biggest enemy. And I didn't really want to be around a lot of people. I didn't want to be around people, period. But it's one thing to have some solitary time for yourself, and it's another one to be isolated. So you know the difference in that. So pay attention to that, okay? Out of control, oh my goodness. And confused? Yes. The emptiness, the insecurity, the loneliness, the deprivation, the soreness, the crying. You know, I didn't realize that your muscles can feel sore from grief. Yeah. Deprived. You know, when Chad died, all I saw were happy couples everywhere. And you know they were 100% happy, right? But that's what it looked like to me because I felt so deprived. Poor concentration. Holy moly. I think I lost my keys about 6 times that first year. That memory lapse business, that poor concentration. Dreams, appetite changes. Grief often feels like a roller coaster. And you'd be doing just fine. And you think, oh, good. Oh, okay, it's a good day. It's a good day. And then one thing happens, a song, a smell, something that reminds you, and down you go, right? And a lot of times we feel like, oh my gosh, I have to start over. We really don't heal. You know, a lot of us have this image that we heal in this sort of stair step motion. But I have found that the healing takes place much more as a spiral. And as we heal, we will feel, there'll be those days when you feel sad, very, very sad again as you go. And it feels like, oh no, am I starting over? You're not starting over. Your feelings are your feelings. You will feel, we'll get to that in a minute. Those feelings. So when you feel sad, just know, of course I'm feeling sad. That's appropriate. It's an appropriate feeling to have. But you're healing in a spiral. You won't forget what you know. You won't forget what you're learning. It'll be okay. You're not starting over just because you feel like you're going backwards. When it comes to grief, oftentimes you have to go backward before you go forward. So there's a lot of remembering that will come up. That's the nature of grief. And that's the way you heal. It's okay. Those memories are really important. And children and little ones, they know this intrinsically. Children in grief will often revert to wetting the bed, sucking their thumb, talking baby talk. And it's because they know they have to go backwards to go forwards. So that's a really important piece about grief. Sometimes it feels like a wave that just slams you and overwhelms you, right? Just like the grocery store experience. And that's what you do with it. If you can allow that wave to wash over you and just cooperate with it, cry, write, do whatever, talk to a friend, do what you need to do, say it all out loud, that wave will wash back out and you'll find some relief, right? It's when we keep stuffing and holding on to it and trying not to feel it. Sometimes what we resist persists. So see if you can cooperate with that wave as best you can. Again, honor your feelings. It's counterintuitive to move toward pain, right? The stove is hot, don't touch it. This is what we learn early on. But in grief requires us to feel it to heal it. But here's how we're going to feel it, a little bit at a time, right? We're going to dose ourselves with it. This is not, okay, now I'm going to feel this, or I'm going to run away from it. It's neither one of those. It's simply do what you can. That's why if you can cooperate with that wave, that's what you're doing, is you are feeling it so it can heal. There's I've heard it expressed as befriend grief. That does not mean that grief is my friend, but it does mean that I recognize, oh, that's what's going on here. And I know what this is. I know what to do with this. That's what I hope you're able to do at the end of 5 weeks, is that you recognize, that's what this is. This is grief. I know what to do with this. I know how to help myself here. Okay? So let's see, what else do I have here? Yeah, why would we want to face the pain of loss instead of running away from it? I thought that was a fine question. I think I remember asking this question a few times. Because it's exhausting to run from your own feelings, right? It doesn't work and it doesn't serve us and it leaves us without peace. The pain can't soften and our hearts can't heal. Unresolved grief causes emotional damage when we're trying to relate to ourselves, family, and friends. There's just no way around that. And a little bit, another piece of my story that I think is important, and especially in this area, because I relate to all of this. That's how I was living for a long time in my life. When I was 14 years old, my dad was killed in an accident on his job site. And so he went to work and he just didn't come home. As a 14-year-old, of course, I didn't have the skills to deal with that. And so what I did was I did what I could and I stuffed that pain. And stuffed grief in me looked like perfection, right? Perfectionism. I remember at 17 thinking, okay, this actually happened and I can't do anything about it. So I'm not going to feel sad. I'm not going to feel mad. And believe me, I was both. I was so mad. Honestly, I was so mad at God, but I didn't know that I could express that. And I was so sad that I thought, oh no, I can never just feel how sad I am. I will never live through that. And if I ever start crying, really crying, I'll never stop. So I just decided I was going to cut off my feelings that I didn't like. And isn't that a 17-year-old? And I did that, and I just went on. I eventually found a man I fell madly in love with. I had 2 children, but the whole time, and it was 20 years later before I faced the effect of the death of my dad on me and my life. But what it looked like for me was I kept trying to be perfect and felt like a total imposter the entire time for those 20 years. And perfection, we'll get to it in a minute, but it's a great avoidance technique because you never reach it and you never feel good about yourself. And I perfected it. But all of these things were so true for me. Bless my little heart. And it gives me great compassion for my young self right there. Because that was how I felt. Yeah. And I couldn't let anybody ever really know who I was because I didn't like who I was. I thought I was an imposter all the time. If that makes sense. That's painful business right there, all of this. So here's what my friend says. I love this. The bear that's chasing you is fear, and the way you feed it is run from it. It's a man by the name of Michael Dye. I was at a workshop one time and this woman said, "What are you working on?" And I was doing so much work on myself to work through all of this. Because 20 years after my dad died, my father-in-law died, and the gift that he gave me with his passing was that the lid came off all those feelings and I couldn't stuff them anymore. And I had to find someone to help me. And I reached out for help for the first time and started very gently as I could, dosing myself with the pain, right? A little at a time. And so during that time, I went to the seminar and this woman said, "What are you working on?" And I could hardly get it out of my mouth. And I said, I'm afraid to find out who I am. And she said, "Booga booga." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Booga booga. That's the boogeyman. That's just something that's scaring you. You already are who you are. If you will look to see who you are, you can change whatever you don't like." And man, what she said for me, that was the bear that was chasing me, right? She said, "You're afraid, it's the dragon at the door. You're afraid to open that door because if you open it, it's going to eat you." I said, "Exactly." And she said, "No, you're going to open it. You're going to find out it's not as big as you think it is, and you're going to eat it one bite at a time." And that gave me permission. Somehow she said exactly what I needed to hear. And so I was off and running and working on the things in my life that were in the way of my own happiness and my own heart healing. Yeah. So I always think of that with that bear. It's like, no, I am not running from this. So when something shows up for me now, and this is where I use these tools in my life all the time. That's why I love this information. And so what I will do is I will stop and say, no, I am not going to run from this. What is it? And what can I do about it? Yeah. So if something's happening with me, I get out a piece of paper and go, what am I mad about? And I just start writing. If I say, what am I afraid of? I just start writing. I just put my pen to paper and go. Yeah. Yeah, I like that saying. It really reminds me. So what stops us? What are these obstacles that get in our way? People's expectations of how we're supposed to move through this. Yeah. Cultural messages. We talked about that. Band-Aid cures. People will come to me and say, "Well, I've been to counselors and they don't help." And I say, "Oh, really? How many times did you go?" "Once." That's a Band-Aid cure. Unacknowledged and unnamed losses. This is really interesting. We have a lot of losses in our life that we don't acknowledge, that we haven't named. Now, we don't have to look at those and then work on all of them. a lot of times as we work through our losses, once we acknowledge that these other losses happen, those soften as well. That the healing takes place in a lot of different places. And so you'll find that one of our homeworks tonight is going to be to write a list of your unnamed losses, right? An example, one of my friends said, I didn't realize that when I moved, something as simple as the school she went to, she was a little kid, 4th grade, they had already done the math that she didn't learn. And she didn't want to let them know that, but she struggled from then on. And she felt stupid and all of those things. That was an unnamed loss in her life. So we'll talk about that when we get to homework. What we don't talk about, those are often the obstacles that keep us from being able to process our grief. Stuffing our feelings is the most common. And, you know, I made an art out of that one. So we can be really good at that. So the goal is to find healthy ways to express our thoughts and feelings that don't hurt us or others. And in doing that, we can face the pain, process our emotions a little at a time with kindness, compassion toward ourselves and others. What usually happens is we stuff our feelings and we stuff them and stuff them and stuff them. And then what happens? Somebody stands on our last nerve and we blow. So then we add guilt and we carry guilt about that, right? So that's what we're trying to do here. I have done this class with a dear friend of mine, this guy, and he has this, it's kind of a gross explanation, but it's powerful. He said, go to your favorite restaurant and eat your favorite meal. Don't leave, eat it again. Don't leave, eat it a 3rd time. I'm telling you, that's going to come up and it's not going to be pretty. And that's the way he explains this whole thing of stuffing your emotions, right? Our feelings are going to come up no matter what. Just because we ignore them doesn't mean they're not there. They're going to show up in places we don't want them to. And so that's why we want to be able to understand our emotions. So this emotions need motion. That's that idea. We have got to move those emotions out of ourselves. And in so doing, we work ourselves through grief. If that makes sense, we're back to that definition, right? Grief is how we feel and think when we have loss. Mourning is the outward expression of that. So we take our emotions and we put them into motion in some way. And again, there are lots of different ways to do this. Writing, talking, crying, laughing, painting, listening to music, making music. There's lots of different ways to express our emotions and our thoughts. Over time, this action will allow that pain to soften. And we can find a new way to live in this world in a new reality, right? As we reconcile our pain and we can find meaning and hope again. Now, I could not believe that at the time, that I could find hope again. And so one of the things I did was I borrowed the hope from the person who was talking. I borrowed it from my friends when they said, oh yeah, you can move through this place. There's a possibility of being able to move through this place. Sometimes we think we need something bigger. Well, no, no, give me something else. Just processing my feelings is not enough. And sometimes we need something else, right? I needed that psychologist who helped me work through, because we can get stuck in our pain and it becomes complicated, right? Personally, I think grief is pretty complicated anyway. But that's so true that we need somebody else to help us. But these are the things that we can do. So what happens when when we are trying not to have our feelings? I think this one's important. Certainly was in my life. Is we develop these avoidance techniques, right? We fall back on them because they work. They temporarily work. Here's some fine examples of some avoidance techniques. Now, my favorites on this list were, of course, perfectionism, busyness. Oh my goodness, I didn't have time to take care of myself. I didn't have time to feel anything because that was what I was trying to do, not feel anything. Overeating. Food became my thing. When my dad died, I found comfort because it worked. That's why I went there. We go to these places because they work. Now, they're temporary and they're self-destructive. But when we start using them, that's not a part of our thinking. We just know it stops the pain. We don't care if it's temporary. And we also don't know. Truly, we usually don't know because we usually choose these young. Whenever we need a survival skill, that's when we're going to choose these avoidance techniques, right? They start out as that way. They later become our coping mechanism. And they are most often, you could actually say always are self-destructive, especially on that list. So here's how the test of your coping skills. Are your coping skills working? This is how you test them. Do they cause a problem? Because if they cause a problem, they're a problem, right? That is the simplest way I have found to decide if what I'm doing is a self-destructive coping skill. So how do we break it? What do we do? We can only work with what we know. So first we have to acknowledge that it is a self-destructive coping skill. Learn from others who understand this process. Learn new healthy coping skills and apply them on a regular basis. You know, before I got help around this grief and loss, I read every self-help book on the market. I went on every diet. I did everything I could, but I couldn't sustain it, right? And then I just felt like a total failure all the time. And so I had no idea that I was going about it in a way that I could not find success in the pattern that I was using. So that's where, so here's what I do. Here's an example. You guys just have to stick with me. I know I orbit, but I promise I'll bring you back. Okay. So here's what I do when I am afraid of something, and it does not have to be big. It can be little. When I feel anxious about something, man, I am at the pantry door, my hand on the knob, right? And I used to just hate myself for that. And I was so condemning of myself and so mad at myself for it. And so here's what I do now. When I say have some compassion for yourself, right? Compassion. I'm going to tell you a quick story. I promise I'll get back to the pantry. So my son was 3 years old and I was cooking breakfast and I heard him padding down the stairs, right? And I heard him stop behind me. I could feel him. And I turned around and looked at him, and he had gotten a cold in the night, and his face, pardon me, was covered in snot. And I said to him, "Oh, honey, oh." And he said, "I feel so sorry for me." Right? And I said, "Oh, I feel sorry for you too. Let me clean you up." Right? Now that's self-compassion. He was not having a pity party. He had some compassion. And so back to the pantry. So I get my hand on put my hand on the handle, and I'm like, "Oh, honey, what are you afraid of? What's going on? What are you afraid of? You want that bag of cookies? You can have that bag of cookies. You're a grown-up. You can do whatever you want to. Nothing's stopping you. But what is it you're afraid of that's driving you there? What's up here? What are you mad about that you're not expressing?" So I get out that stupid piece of paper and my pen, and I ask myself that question, and I just start writing. Oh my gosh. Now, I can go back and have that bag of cookies if that's where I'm going. But if I do, I feel like crap about myself, and I know it. And so that's how I help myself. That's how I face that bear. Yeah, the bear chasing me is fear. The way you feed it is run from it. I am not going to run from that bear anymore. That's my goal. I'm going to turn around and ask myself a simple question. What are you afraid of? What's going on? Because my feelings are driving me, and they are not facts. And feelings, letting my feelings drive, is like putting a 4-year-old in control of the wheel for me. So it's like, no, feelings are like a light on your dashboard. They tell you something's going on. They're great information. Feelings are really important, right? The idea is, here's your rational mind, here's your emotional mind, and in the middle is your wise mind. And so that's what we want to be able to do. We want to be able to have full access to our thinking and full access to our feelings. But if I'm afraid of these, I don't get wisdom. I can't get to my wise mind. I want to be able to access both. And so I don't want to be afraid of my feelings, nor do I want them running my life. And so that's the way I use this. So we learn from others. Yeah. So here are the phases. These are some phases of grief and mourning. There's a numbness, a shock, right? At first. Eventually, we can grow into acknowledging the reality of the loss. If we can process grief and express it outside ourselves, if we can get to mourning, we can acknowledge the reality of the loss. And then we can face our feelings and process them. Again, this is all very messy stuff, because you may move from this one to this one, and this one back up to numbness, and it's totally messy, right? But we can face our feelings, process them, search for meaning, and work through and find some release of the pain and some hope for the future. I could not have this at first. I wasn't suicidal. I didn't want to die. I just didn't want to live, nor did I know how. How in the world am I going to walk around on this earth without this person who was such a big part of my life? For me, it was death. Oftentimes this happens with divorce. How am I going to walk around without that job that I absolutely loved? How am I going to, yeah, all of these losses will have this effect on us. And so these are the phases that will happen as we move through grief and mourning. We don't get over grief, right? We integrate it into our lives. It becomes a part of us. It actually helps us grow. There's a part of me I have a space in me that has become bigger, that is filled with more love because of the grief that I've worked through in my life, if that makes sense. If we've lost a loved one, or the death of a relationship or a love, that relationship becomes one of memory, right? My relationship with my husband now is one of memory. But the relationship doesn't die, and neither does love. But I've relocated him someplace else in my heart, and I just carry him with me. I do the same thing with my grandparents. Think of the people that you love that have passed, that still affect you in a positive way, right? That you carry around with you. The ones that we work to let go of completely are the ones who haven't affected us in a positive way, right? And we will talk about some ways to do that when we get to the 4th class, by the way, okay? We're not leaving someone behind. We had someone in class, and she said to her counselor, I feel like, her brother passed, and she said, I feel like you're saying, we're in the car, we're driving away, and I'm supposed to leave him on the curb. And she said, no, not put him in the car. No, that is not the idea. We are not leaving loved ones behind. We're going to experience those grief bursts we talked about. And that hope, again, is that one day the love will outweigh the pain. So this is where I see people get stuck all the time. I certainly was stuck here, where our expectations or our dreams don't actually match our actual life. Does that make sense? Okay, sure it does. I'm sure you're shaking your head, yes. And so here's how this works. Trying to reconcile these two, all this grief is in here. Because here's the thing, the minute we have a big change of some sort, it's a new reality, isn't it? If somebody gets a diagnosis, it's a new reality instantly. When Chad died and I walked out of that hospital, I was in there, it was a new reality for me, but I could not embrace that reality at the moment. And I just felt like I wanted the world to stop turning for a little bit and give me a chance. But it doesn't, does it? And that's disappointing. But my expectation, this is not what I had planned. I did not plan to be without him. At that time, he died pretty young. So people kept saying to me, we were just going to have to accept it. And honestly, what I thought was, you accept it. I'm accepting nothing, right? Because I'm pretty stubborn, but I have discovered if I take stubborn and I get it going the right direction, it really serves me. But honestly, I was so sad about that because I thought, I don't know what to do about this because I cannot resign myself to this. Because to me, my definition of acceptance at that point was give up. And I'm not good at that. So what I did was I said to the universe, I said to God, you're going to have to give me another definition because I don't know what to do with this. And then I just let it be. And one day I was getting my hair done and I opened a magazine, highlighted in the corner of the page is a new definition of acceptance. And it's this one right here on the screen. Acceptance is not resignation. It's understanding that it is what it is and there's got to be a way through. Now that I could embrace. That I could embrace because I have worked through, I'm always looking for the way through something, right? That I could go with. And this is Michael J. Fox wrote that. And if you don't know who he is, he's an actor who has struggled for years with early onset Parkinson's disease. And he's one of the most positive people out there. So that has become my favorite definition of acceptance. And so with that, I could eventually, right? You've got to be patient with yourself. This takes time. I could eventually reconcile these two things, my actual life and my expectations, so I could embrace a new reality in my life where I could find meaning and hope again. That's what that's about. So are you ready? You ready for your homework?
Joni, before you hop into homework, you had 2 slides ago, there was a question that came up of how do you deal with grief when the relationship was toxic?
Oh my goodness. This is really good. Because so many times we'll stay in a toxic relationship, right? We stay in it. We need to ask ourselves those sweet questions again. Why? Why do I stay when it's toxic? Am I addressing that question? Is that what you mean? How do you, because are you in grief during this relationship? Is this ongoing? That's kind of the question. Or is this something that was a toxic relationship and you got out of it?
Grief after a person has died.
Grief after a person's gotten out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or the person who was toxic in their life passed, and maybe they weren't able to move past that toxicity or process through it or things like that.
Oh, that's so good. That's such a good question. Because oftentimes this happens. I have people come to me and say, okay, I am not sad that my husband died because he was abusive and terrible. And what do I do with that? And so here's the thing about that. That's just honest right there. And this often happens with when we're raised in a dysfunctional family as well. And we get stuck in our past, right? We want to be able to let our past inform us, not entrap us. And so when a toxic person has passed in our lives, the biggest grief we usually have around that is what we didn't get, right? We didn't get a good relationship. We didn't get that heal. I'll put this in the, my dad was not toxic, but he had PTSD like crazy. And one of the things that I got stuck in was, if he had lived, we could have worked through and would have had a great relationship. I could have had a great relationship with my dad as an adult, especially. And a counselor said to me one time, you know, he could have never been able to get through that PTSD and you would have had a crap relationship with him. And I'm like, what? I never thought of that, right? But I had to mourn what I didn't get from my dad. So I just took it that simply. I didn't get to know him as an adult. I didn't get to understand him. He didn't get to understand me. I started thinking about the things that I didn't get, and I made a list of them, and I went through and I grieved each one of those. That's how I worked through it. Because my biggest grief at one point was what I didn't get from that relationship. Right? And I let it be what it was. On the day I got married and he didn't walk me down the aisle, there's a perfect example. Right? I was grieving again. The grief popped up. And so when grief pops up, I just let it. And I make a space for it. And then I move through it. So that's part of it, is recognize what you wanted from that relationship that didn't happen. And then be sure you let somebody help you walk through that. Yeah? Does that answer it? Is that it? Okay.
Yes.
Anything else? Any other questions or clarifications?
No, there's a lot of stuff in the chat that I will send you after so you can read it for next week. But
Oh, perfect.
yes.
And I'll
I
address it
do
next
wanna,
week.
yeah, I want to make sure people are asking questions about the homework. So I'm going to let you
good.
go through the rest of your slides.
Okay, here you go. Write a record of loss. So what you're going to do as best you can, understanding that grief comes in so many different ways, name your losses. Okay? And you can do it, just think about as early as you can and move through it. Because no one gets out of high school without a bunch of loss. It's just the way it is. And a lot of losses happen when we're young, right? If we're bullied, if we're all of those things, if we had a horrible teacher who made us feel bad about ourselves, all of those kinds of things, just recognize that you have these unnamed, unmourned losses. And as I say, it doesn't mean you're going to go through and have to grieve all of these and mourn all of these as you go, but somehow recognizing them honors who you are and where you are in your life. Okay. And the other one is journaling. 5 minutes a day, that's all. Right? You want to write longer, you can, but give it a shot. And it's this is a tool that will take you through. There are very few things that will take you through grief faster, but this will. It will help you move through, because you can allow the pain and the loss to live on the paper instead of living in here and affect your heart all the time. So here's the way you do it. Be absolutely honest. You don't have to have any great writing skills. You can write anything you want, any way you want. I destroy the pages when I journal because I'm working through stuff. And if I croak tonight, I don't want my kids to find it and think that's who I am. So I tear it up and I throw it away. I have a friend who journals and then she sends it through the shredder. Yeah. It's private. It's just for you and your journey, right? And here are some suggestions. If you have a hard time, this will get you going. Most people don't journal because it makes them feel things and all their feelings come up. That's okay. Do as best you can, a little bit at a time, right? Don't overdo. Be kind to yourself. Be gentle. But these are great. My biggest struggle right now, the worst thing about my loss is, and I seem to cry the most when. Those are really helpful. They'll get you started. So here you go. Try not to compare your losses or minimize them. Grief is unique to each of us. Be patient with yourself and others. Here I am again. Treat yourself as a treasured friend. So hard to do and so important. Borrow hope from someone if you don't have any. You can have some of mine. I have a lot of it for you. And there's help for you as we navigate through this wilderness of grief. Okay? And I'll see you next week. And thank you
Joni, really
so
quickly.
much.
Oh,
Sure.
sorry. Didn't mean to
No
introduce.
problem.
Can you go back one slide just so that someone asked to show the journal prompts again, just so
There
that
it
we can
is.
give them enough time. Um,
Absolutely.
I will be saving the chat so I can send it over to you, Joni, so you can look at it after group. I just
Excellent.
want to say thank you all so much for being here today. I know that there was a lot going on in the chat, a lot of support, a lot of people sharing their losses and what they've gone through. I just want to say that while we wish we could get through and personally connect with every single person, it is really hard to do that, especially in a large group like this when going through a workshop series. So, if there's any specific resources, we'll be passing them along. We encourage you to, as Joni said, journaling isn't for everyone, but we still, you aren't expected to be perfect. It's just for you, and it's just in preparation for next week. But we are so, so glad for all of you to be here. We are so grateful for Joni putting on this workshop series. And, we look forward to seeing you next week. You can feel free to reach out to me or the resources inbox that I put in the chat. I'm just going to put it back in the chat again. Take care of yourselves tonight. Take care of yourselves, over the next week. Do what you need to do for yourself. And Joni, any final words?
Ditto, everything you're saying. Be gentle, be kind. Yeah. And next week, we're going to be talking in particular about feelings. So that's always a great subject. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Joni. And thank you all.
Sure.
Have a wonderful rest of your week. And we'll see you next week.